Safeguarding vulnerable adults. Let us look at the course overview and objectives. After studying this course and successfully completing the assessment, you should be able to understand the concepts of adult vulnerability, adult protection, and significant harm to enable recognition of the signs of vulnerability and an appreciation of adult protection issues. Define abuse and bullying and be aware of the signs and symptoms that indicate these main forms of abuse. Examine the law surrounding the protection of adults and identify an individual's role and responsibilities in relation to disclosure. There are many young people and adults in society who are at the risk of danger. They are at risk of harm from others due to their inability to protect themselves. Adults interact with vulnerable adults in a wide range of settings and organisations. There are millions of adults who live, work, and play in environments where adults provide and facilitate education, leisure, support and care. The term environment includes a wide range of familiar institutions, including schools, colleges, hospitals, care homes, and of course the family home. A wide range of agencies delivers care, education, and leisure services to adults, and there is a legal requirement on all such agencies to protect the adults for which they have responsibility. Examples of some of the types of agencies are health and social care agencies, hospitals, registered care homes, foster homes, private homes, recreational agencies, sports clubs, bowls, swimming, technology clubs, needlecraft, etc., church groups. It is hoped that by raising awareness through programs of study such as this, the effects of harm and abuse can be minimised. Abuse of vulnerable adults is illegal and is thought to be more widespread than previously acknowledged. What must be carefully noted is that no matter whether abuse is deliberate or non-deliberate, the effects on the abused are the same. The course objectives are vulnerability and protection. Understand the need for safeguarding vulnerable adults training for the whole team. Explain the concepts of protection, vulnerability, and significant harm in relation to vulnerable adults. Identify the responsibility of individuals in protecting vulnerable adults. Recognizing abuse. Define and understand abuse and identify the indicators and related examples of physical, psychological, emotional, sexual, emotional abuse and neglect, in addition to acts of omission. Identify and understand the indicators and related examples of discriminatory, domestic abuse, modern slavery and self-neglect, the 4 additional categories of abuse which were added with the formation of the Care Act 2014. Vulnerable adults protection procedures. Explain the nature of the laws that protect vulnerable adults protection law and the related processes for managing disclosure. Apply a range of knowledge and understanding to solve practical adult abuse situations. It is important that we look at what is defining safeguarding. Before we can examine the issues that surround the protection of vulnerable adults, we must first establish what is a vulnerable adult. The law requires that safeguarding adults is everyone's business. The Care Act 2014 ensures that safeguarding vulnerable adults means protecting a person's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. In British law, a vulnerable adult is defined as being aged 18 years old or over and at risk of abuse or neglect because of their needs and/or support. A vulnerable adult, then, by definition, is far less able to protect itself. Without adequate protection, an adult with needs is at risk of harm, mistreatment, exploitation, or neglect from others. This makes the adult vulnerable. Adults with mental disabilities, mature age or illnesses do not understand their vulnerability, which is one of the main reasons they are at even greater risk of mistreatment or harm. The law states that it is the responsibility or duty of care of staff and volunteers in public, voluntary, and private organisations to protect the vulnerable adults for which they are responsible. In addition, such staff must ensure that there is a minimum risk of harm and exposure to the perpetrators of harm for all vulnerable adults. In this country, every adult has a right to a life free of fear, harm and neglect, not to be forced to do anything against their will, to be protected, have their choices respected, to be listened to and have a say in their care. It is clear, therefore, that due to their vulnerability, vulnerable adults need the protection of adults who can assist them in living a life free of harm and abuse. Protection is a method of guarding against danger or harm to ensure that vulnerable adults are safe and free from the risk of significant harm. Significant harm is defined as the ill treatment leading to impairment of health or development. We will explore the concept of significant harm in greater detail a little later. Let us look at defining abuse. The Encyclopedia of Medicine defines abuse as any action that intentionally harms or injures another person. Many adults can live a life happy, healthy, and free from harm. Being a vulnerable adult can expose them to requiring assistance in achieving this life, therefore making them more susceptible to harm and abuse. There are a large variety of types and patterns of adult abuse, which may occur repeatedly or as a single act of abuse. Where a particularly abusive situation occurs, it's because one party is seeking to control the other through abuse. Victims of abuse must understand that the abuse is wrong and that the abuse is never their fault. Abuse can occur in a variety of relationships. However, it is most commonly committed by a person the victim knows and often lives with. When one partner abuses another, it's known as intimate partner abuse. Abuse within families is often known as domestic abuse or domestic violence. In 2011, the NHS report, Abuse of Vulnerable Adults in England, stated that 25% of offenders causing harm to the vulnerable adult is more likely to be a family member, and 25% documented were attributed to social care staff. Who is a vulnerable adult? Our study will focus on adults, their vulnerability, and the need for them to be protected in a range of community, care, education, and other supported environments. Anyone can be a vulnerable adult who is of adult age and at risk of harm, which can occur anywhere, including own homes, public places, care, nursing homes, residential, sheltered housing, social clubs and groups, hospitals including residential psychiatric wards. Vulnerable adults do not understand the meaning or implications of their vulnerability. The statutory guidance, developed by the government, is always to ensure the protection of vulnerable adults. An adult that is considered to be at risk: those suffering with long-term illness or condition for which they receive healthcare, are elderly and weak, have learning difficulties, physical or mental disabilities, sensory impairment, are victims of domestic abuse, being bullied or homeless, detained in psychiatric ward or lawful custody, are unable to make decisions for themselves and requires support and care. As defined in the Care Act 2014, a local authority must act when it has reasonable cause to suspect that an adult in its area, whether or not ordinarily resident there, has needs for care and support, whether or not the authority is meeting any of those needs, is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect, as a result of those needs, is unable to protect himself or herself against the abuse or neglect or the risk of it. There are no defined criteria in which to judge abuse of a vulnerable adult. It is judged upon a range of factors, including the severity of the ill treatment, degree and extent of physical harm, duration and frequency of abuse and neglect, extent of premeditation, degree of threat and coercion, presence of sexual abuse. Sometimes a single traumatic event may account to abuse, such as a violent assault, suffocation or poisoning. More often, Abuse is a collection of significant events, both acute and long-standing, which can interrupt, change, or damage the vulnerable adult's physical and psychological development. To understand and establish whether abuse has or is likely to occur, it is necessary to consider the vulnerable adult's individual needs, emotional, psychological, and behavioural, the ability of the carer, providing support and guidance, setting routines and providing stability, the family and environmental factors, housing, employment, income and community resources, the nature of the harm, ill treatment or the inability to provide adequate care. It is important to recognise that abuse may be caused by acts of both omission and of commission, an adult or young person, a stranger or somebody in a position of trust. We will now look at law and legislation. There are many laws and legislation across the United Kingdom that control the safeguarding of vulnerable adults. They all govern responsibilities and duties on the relevant adult social care services within local authorities, as they are the lead agencies for protecting vulnerable adults. The relevant acts give decisive responsibilities to government, public and healthcare sectors to ensure that all those people that are in vulnerable situations are protected from harm. In the UK, the following pieces of legislation came into force. England, the Care Act 2014, officially April 2015. Northern Ireland, Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Order 2007. Scotland, Adult Support and Protection Act 2007. Wales, Social Services and Wellbeing Act 2014, officially 6th of April 2016. You will observe that although each piece of legislation is worded slightly differently, they cover the same issues and have the same fundamental principles. We will look at the following acts more closely. The Care Act 2014. The aim of this Act is to set out a clear legal framework for how local authorities and other parts of the system should protect adults at risk of abuse or neglect. The Care Act 2014 explains the responsibilities for the safeguarding and protection of vulnerable adults at risk of abuse and neglect. The Act was produced to bring a variety of legislation together, creating a whole new Act. The Care Act 2014 replaced many old acts that were in need of updating and/or replacement. For example, Health Services and Public Health Act 1968, National Assistance Act 1948, and many others. As you're aware now, the statutory guidance stipulates that safeguarding means protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. To do this, it requires people and agencies working together to prevent and stop both the risks and experience of abuse or neglect, ensure that the adult's well-being is promoted, have regard for the adult's views, wishes, feelings and beliefs when deciding on any action. Strong multi-agency partnerships are formed by local authorities to ensure effective prevention of abuse to vulnerable adults and by supporting the development of constructive learning surroundings at various levels of access. Safeguarding principles. There are 6 key principles set out in the Care Act 2014 that reinforce all work taken to safeguard vulnerable adults. These are: Principle 1, empowerment. Adults ask for what they want and receive support that is personal to them and have given their consent. Principle 2, prevention. Signs are recognised and clear decisive actions are taken before harm occurs to the vulnerable adult. Principle 3, proportionality. Professionals to work in the vulnerable adult's best interests and responses are proportionate to the presented risks. Principle 4, protection. Professionals to provide help and support for those in the greatest need. Principle 5, partnership. Professional services within the local community join together to share only the information that prevents, detects, and reports neglect and abuse. Principle 6, accountability. Safeguarding of vulnerable adults should be delivered with transparency and accountability, therefore the adult fully understands the role of everyone in their life. You will revisit these 6 principles again later on in the responsibilities section, as they are closely linked to the sharing of information and protection plans. Let us now look closely at the Mental Capacity Act 2005. This act applies to everyone involved in the care, treatment and support of people aged 16 and over living in England and Wales who are unable to make some decisions for themselves. The MCA is designed to protect and restore power to those vulnerable people who lack capacity. Mental capacity is where a person is unable to make decisions through a lack of capacity to do so. This could be due to head, spinal injuries, disabilities or illness. It is stated in the Mental Capacity Act 2005 that a person is unable to make a decision for themselves if they are unable to do one or more of the following things: to understand the information relevant to the decision, retain the information given to them, use or reflect on that information as part of that process of making the decision, communicate the decision, whether by talking, using sign language or any other means. It is of vital importance that a decision in the best interests of the vulnerable adult, made by a suitable adult under the Mental Capacity Act 2005, should always encourage the adult to participate in decisions, try to identify all the things that adult would want to include in making that decision, their individual views, avoiding discrimination, and to assess if the adult might regain mental capacity. Dementia. According to the Alzheimer's Organisation, dementia is not a specific disease. It's an overall term that describes a group of symptoms associated with a decline in memory or other thinking skills severe enough to reduce a person's ability to perform everyday activities. Dementia affects all people regardless of gender, ethnicity or age, and currently affects 850,000 people in the UK, with estimated numbers set to rise to 1 million by 2025. In April 2017, the World Health Organization studies show that the figures of the number of people living with dementia worldwide is currently estimated at 47 million and is projected to increase to 75 million by 2030. The symptoms of dementia can include difficulty in performing familiar tasks, loss of memory, confusion and misplacing things, changes in mood or behaviour, poor judgement in making decisions. There are 7 stages of dementia. Stage 1. No decline. No memory problems or other symptoms are evident. Stage 2. Very mild decline. Minor memory problems, though still do well on memory tests. Stage 3. Mild decline. Having trouble organising and planning, remembering names of new friends. Stage 4. Moderate decline. Have difficulty with simple arithmetic, poor short-term memory. Stage 5. Moderately severe decline. Difficulty dressing appropriately, significant confusion. Stage 6. Severe decline. Confusion or inability to remember details of personal history. Stage 7. Very severe decline. Lose ability to communicate and in final stages, swallow. If these symptoms occur, then the vulnerable adult is at an increased risk of abuse financially and other forms of abuse. Those affected by dementia will require someone to act in their best interests as time goes on and the vulnerable adult's condition declines through the stages of dementia. Health and Social Care Act 2012. This Act ended 3 previous directives: Commission for Social Care, Healthcare Commission, Mental Health Act Commission in England, and created the Care Quality Commission, CQC. All care provided by care homes, hospitals, ambulances, dentists, home care services, and any other care-related establishments must all meet the regulations as set out by this independent manager. Equality Act 2010. This Act combines the majority of all the United Kingdom's anti-discrimination laws into one single law. The Act applies to all organisations that provide a service to the public. the Act specifies 9 features that are protected. These are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religious belief or non-belief, sex and sexual orientation. Protection of Freedoms Act 2012, Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006. The UK's government's legislative programme to safeguard public rights and reduce the burden of government intrusion into the lives of individuals. The Act oversaw changes which were implemented, primarily the creation of the Disclosure and Barring Service, which had been formed from the Criminal Records Bureau and Independent Safeguarding Authority, changes to regulated activity and work that a barred person must not do. The Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act was passed to help avoid harm or risk of harm by preventing people who are deemed unsuitable to work with children and vulnerable adults from gaining access to them through their work. The Independent Safeguarding Authority was established as a result of this Act. Local Safeguarding Adults Board, SAB. As part of the formation of the Care Act 2014, a requirement included the establishment of a Safeguarding Adults Board, SAB, to bring together the statutory members of the local authorities, NHS, and police to coordinate actions that protects adults from abuse or neglect. The SAB is to ensure any persons aged 18 years or over are protected from risk of harm, abuse or neglect. They are to establish a person's needs for care and support, and as a result of any needs, the services they require. All professionals are to be aware of their local area Safeguarding Adults Board to ensure they are meeting their requirements for safeguarding. It is imperative that the SAB organise a Safeguarding Adults Review, SAR, when a vulnerable adult in their area dies as a result of abuse or neglect, and to discuss if there is a concern that partnership services could have worked more efficiently and effectively to protect the vulnerable adult. A Safeguarding Adults Review must also be organised in the event that a vulnerable adult has not died, but there is a suspicion that they have experienced serious risk of harm, abuse or neglect. The reviews are put into place to ensure that any actions which went wrong can be rectified for the future, and all services can improve their standards as a result of the highlighted wrongdoing. Care Quality Commission Fundamental Standards, Regulation 13 Safeguarding, 2014. The intention of this regulation, which came into force in April 2015, is to safeguard people who use services from suffering any form of abuse or improper treatment while receiving care and treatment. The Care Quality Commission, CQC, has a duty to monitor how well providers are doing to safeguard the adults in their care by assessing the quality and safety of care they provide. They produce reports on providers displaying the ratings in various areas as to whether they are safe, effective, caring, responsive, and well-led. They will also assess whether the services are assisting those people whose circumstances may make them vulnerable, experiencing poor mental health, including people with dementia, older people, people with long-term conditions, families, children and young people, working-age people, including recently retired and students. The annual report on the NHS State of Care declared that 31st of July 2017, 78% adult social care locations rated good, 2% outstanding, 19% required improvement, and 1% inadequate. 31st of July 2018, 79% adult social care locations rated good, 3% outstanding, 17% required improvement, and 1% inadequate, which shows a marked improvement from the previous year to the following year and their commitment to safeguarding vulnerable adults. The Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups, Northern Ireland, Order, 2007. The order makes provision for checking persons seeking to work with children or vulnerable adults and for barring those considered to be unsuitable for such posts, whether in paid employment or voluntary work. You can read further information on this order by going onto the www.legislation.gov.uk website. Adult Support and Protection, Scotland Act 2007. This Act seeks to protect and benefit adults at risk of being harmed. The Act requires councils and a range of public bodies to work together to support and protect adults who are unable to safeguard themselves, their property, and their rights. You can read more about the Adult Support and Protection Scotland Act 2007 by going on to the www.legislation.gov.uk website. Wales Social Services and Wellbeing Act 2014 and Care Inspectorate, Wales. The Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act did not come into force until 6th of April 2016. The Act provides the legal framework for improving the well-being of people who need care and support, and carers who need support, and for transforming social services in Wales. You can read more about this Act by going to the www.legislation.gov.uk website and the www.careinspectorate.wales/regulations website. Let us look at the types and forms of abuse. Facts presented in the NHS Final Report on Abuse of Vulnerable Adults in England 2012 state that physical abuse was the most common type of abuse reported, accounting for 30% of all allegations, followed by neglect with 23% and financial abuse with 20%. 41% of vulnerable adults were more likely to be abused in their own home, and 34% abused in a care home than any other place. 62% of referrals were for women. 61% were for adults aged 65 years or over. 49% of referrals were for adults with a physical disability. 80% of people over 70 years have mobility issues. 23% were for mental health patients. 20% were for people with learning difficulties. 7% were for adults with a substance misuse. Organisations have a key role to play in protecting vulnerable adults from abuse. Already we have examined and defined abuse. However, abuse takes on many different forms. To effectively recognise abuse, it is important to have a detailed understanding of the forms abuse can take. Let us now look in more detail at the various types of abuse. Every day, there are vulnerable adults who are hungry, neglected, sexually exploited, unloved, and fearful. Vulnerable adults have the right to a safe, loving, and nurturing environment. There are 6 original main types of adult abuse, namely physical abuse, psychological, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, financial abuse, organisational abuse. Any of these forms of abuse put at risk of vulnerable adult survival, safety, self-esteem, growth and development. As a result of the Care Act 2014, 4 further types of abuse were included during April 2015, which comprises of discriminatory abuse, domestic abuse, modern slavery and self-neglect. A vulnerable adult may display the signs as indicated below. However, this is not conclusive evidence that abuse is taking place. It is important to be aware of the indicators, behavioural changes, and the presence of these signs in clusters and not just the presence of one single indicator. We will examine each of these 4 forms of abuse in more detail through exploring a definition, some examples of the kind of actions involved, some behavioural indicators which might suggest that this form of abuse is happening, some physical indicators which might suggest that this form of abuse is happening. We will now look at physical abuse. The definition is the physical ill treatment which may or may not cause injury or discomfort, but which will harm or damage the health, emotions, well-being or development of the vulnerable adult. Examples of this are punching or hitting, shaking or pushing, poisoning, smothering, force-feeding, burning or scalding, inappropriate use of restraints. Behavioural indicators can be inconsistent explanation for an injury, says cannot remember how any injury occurred, wary, frightened of people, i.e. carers, volunteers, flinches if touched unexpectedly, extremely aggressive or extremely withdrawn, feel that they deserve to be punished, or worse, feel they have nothing to live for, become suicidal, apprehensive when others cry, afraid to go home, reluctance to pursue medical treatment, changes in general to their behaviour. Physical indicators can be any injury not fully explained by the explanation given, injuries inconsistent with an adult's daily routine, unexplained bruising and/or cuts on face, lips, mouth, body, arms, back, buttocks, thighs, clusters of injuries forming regular patterns or reflecting the shape of an instrument, burns, especially on soles, palms or backs, burns for immersion in hot water, friction burns, rope or electric appliance burns, marks on the body, including slap marks, finger marks, loss of any hair, teeth, injuries at different stages of healing, weak muscles over time, aging process, making them particularly vulnerable to physically stronger, younger people. Let us now look at emotional abuse. Psychological abuse is the use of bullying, rejection, hostility, intimidation, and the use of derogatory language, causing a dismissal of a person's wishes and choices. Psychological abuse affects a person's feelings and inner thoughts, including the prevention of a person's individual personal beliefs. Examples of this are verbal abuse. For example, if you don't stop having accidents, I'm going to rub your face in it. Name-calling, swearing, insulting. Threats of harm, injury. Constantly being shouted at. Put in isolation, in a care home environment. Denied visitors. Controlling, harassment, humiliated. Unnecessary withdrawal of support networks, excluding them from social activities. Behavioural indicators can be changes in character, changes to daily patterns. Examples are sleeping, napping, appetite, unexplained fear, uncertainty, aggressiveness, withdrawn emotionally, overcompliance, apathy, lack of confidence, vacant. What is emotion? In order to define emotional abuse, we first need to be clear what is meant by the word emotion. An emotion can be a pleasant or an unpleasant mental state, which happens as a response to external factors, which can be enjoyable or unpleasant. In general, however, an emotion develops subconsciously. Examples of an emotion are feelings of agreement, anger, certainty, control, disagreement, disgust, disliking, embarrassment, fear, happiness, hate, interest, liking, love, sadness, shame, surprise and uncertainty. In relation to vulnerable adult abuse, the emphasis is usually on the more negative emotions. A definition of this is, emotional abuse is a pattern of behaviour that attacks the vulnerable adult's confidence, sense of worth, and trust in their own judgments. Constant criticism and mocking, by threats or disguised as guidance, teaching, or advice, can lead to emotional abuse. The emotionally abused adult loses all sense of importance and personal value. Emotional abuse strikes at the very heart of the vulnerable adult, creating scars that may be far deeper and more lasting than physical ones. Through emotional abuse, the insults, insinuations, criticism and accusations slowly eat away at the vulnerable adult's self-esteem until she is incapable of judging a situation logically. The vulnerable adult becomes so low emotionally that she often blames herself for the abuse. Emotionally abused adults can become so convinced that they are worthless that they believe that no one else cares for them or loves them. Examples of this are lack of interest in or concern for the vulnerable adult, giving them the feeling that they are worthless or unloved, unwanted, rejected. imposing inappropriate actions or expectations, preventing the vulnerable adult from participating in normal routines, preventing the vulnerable adult from interacting with other adults. Hostility, the vulnerable adult frequently feeling threatened, frightened, intimidated or in danger. Overuse of bad language. Shouting and developing a culture of fear and rejection. Behavioural indicators can be depression, withdrawal or aggressive behaviour, excessively compliant, too neat and clean, learning disorders, sleep disorders, unusual fearfulness, obsessive-compulsive behaviour, phobias, extreme behaviour, suicide attempts, developmental delays. Physical indicators can be changes in appetite and nausea, headaches, bedwetting, habit disorders, repetition of certain acts, rocking, etc. We will now look at forced marriage. The definition is: forced marriage is when you face physical pressure to marry, for example threats, physical violence or sexual violence, or emotional and psychological pressure, i.e., if you're made to feel like you're bringing shame on your family. You have the right to choose who you marry, when you marry, or if you marry at all. The giving of consent by both parties is essential to all marriages, but only the individuals will know if they gave their consent freely. There are clear differences between a forced marriage and an arranged marriage. Where the family of both spouses takes a leading role in arranging the marriage, though the decision to accept the arrangement or not remains with the prospective spouses, this is identified as an arranged marriage. However, in a forced marriage, one or both spouses do not, or through lack of capacity cannot, consent to the marriage they are to endure. Forced marriage is described as such where a vulnerable adult experiences extreme duress, including physical, psychological, emotional, financial, and sexual pressure. Those vulnerable adults who lack in mental capacity will particularly experience duress in this situation. Forced marriage is illegal in England and Wales. This includes taking someone overseas to force them to marry, whether or not the forced marriage takes place. Marrying someone who lacks the mental capacity to consent to the marriage, whether they're pressured to or not. Forcing someone to marry can result in a sentence of up to 7 years in prison. Forced marriage protection orders. You can ask the court for a forced marriage protection order. Each order is unique and is designed to protect you according to your individual circumstances. For example, the court may order someone to hand over your passport or reveal where you are. In an emergency, an order can be made to protect you immediately. Disobeying a forced marriage protection order can result in a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. Forced marriage abroad. Contact the FMU, Forced Marriage Unit, if you think you're about to be taken abroad to get married against your will. Contact the nearest British embassy if you're already abroad. If someone you know is at risk. Contact the FMU, Forced Marriage Unit, if you know someone who's been taken abroad to be forced into marriage. Give as many details as you can, for example, where the person has gone, when they were due back, when you last heard from them. The FMU will contact the relevant embassy. If they're a British national, the embassy will try to contact the person and help them get back to the UK if that's what they want. Support of victims in Scotland. You can download the handbook about being a survivor of forced marriage and receive further support by visiting www.mygov.scot. We will now look at neglect and acts of omission. The definition is the withholding of or failure to provide, whether intentional or unintentional, the help, care or support necessary for a vulnerable adult, resulting in the serious impairment of the adult's health or development. Neglect includes a failure to intervene in dangerous situations. Neglect often does not have obvious signs. The effects of neglect are more emotional and may affect the vulnerable adult's normal or expected development. Examples of this form of abuse are lack of provision of adequate basic needs, e.g. food, clothing, toileting and/or shelter. Lack of provision of personal care needs, including others being able to respond to their needs. Inadequate risk assessment taken, causing harm to vulnerable adult or others. Inadequate protection or not responding to emotional needs. Abandonment, inadequate supervision, leaving a vulnerable adult alone at home. Poor access to proper medication, medical treatment or care. Care plans not being executed that have been put into place. Lack of encouragement to develop and thrive. Intentionally withholding information with regards to a person's rights or entitlements. Behavioural indicators can be frequent absence from clubs, social activities, inappropriate acts or delinquent behaviour, acting out of character, excessive use of alcohol, prescription drugs, lack of appetite, unexplained weight loss, or hungry, begging, stealing food, seeks inappropriate affection and attention of other carers, asking repeatedly to see immediate family members, relatives, friends, or other known adults. Physical indicators can be poor hygiene, being left in soiled clothing and/or bedding, lethargic, reduced mobility, broken mobility or hearing aids, pale appearance, poor skin condition, pressure sores, ulcers, dirty, scruffy or torn clothing, inappropriate clothing for the weather, cold, due to lack of adequate heating, injuries, medical problems that are left untreated, constant hunger, lack of appetite, underweight, poor growth, failure to thrive. We will now look at sexual abuse and e-safety. The definition is, sexual abuse occurs when a vulnerable adult is pressurized, forced or tricked into taking part in any kind of sexual activity with another adult against their will. Any activity that occurs between two adults where one is a vulnerable adult, regardless of consent, is considered sexual abuse. This form of abuse is often something that the vulnerable adult may have little understanding, which may lead them to see this form of abuse as normal. It is more often someone who is known to the vulnerable adult that inflicts this form of abuse as opposed to a stranger. Examples of this form of abuse are prostitution, physical sexual contact, inappropriate touching, involving the vulnerable adult in looking at sexual images, watching sexual activities, encouraging the vulnerable adult to behave in sexually inappropriate way, rape, sexual harassment, exposing genitalia, possibly encouraging the abused person to touch or photograph them naked. Behavioural indicators can be sophisticated or unusual sexual knowledge, poor peer relationships, sleeping disorders, changes in behaviour, aggressive, withdrawn, self-abusive behaviours, self-mutilation, lack of concentration, opting to be on their own whenever possible. Physical indicators can be unusual or excessive itching in the genital, anal, abdominal area, stained or bloody underwear, bleeding in external genitalia, injuries to the vaginal or anal areas, sexually transmitted diseases or urinary tract infections, e.g. recurrent spells of cystitis, difficulty in walking or sitting, pain when urinating, vaginal penile discharge, excessive masturbation, presence of love bites, bruising to specific areas, e.g. wrists, upper arms, thighs, pregnancy, depending on age of vulnerable adult. Cyberbullying is when someone uses technology, like the internet or a mobile phone, to deliberately hurt, humiliate, harass, intimidate or threaten someone else. It is different from bullying, when you were younger, at school or in the community, because it can happen at any time of the day or night, and it may feel like you can't get away from it. This may leave the vulnerable adult feeling scared and unsafe in their own home. The risks of using technology is not restricted to the younger generation. E-safety problems can affect people of all ages, particularly vulnerable adults, as they may act in good faith that what they are doing online is the right thing, without questioning the consequences of their actions. For example, the disclosing of personal data, risks to their financial status, identity theft, and cyberbullying. Here are some links to useful websites to help you protect vulnerable adults with online safety and cyberbullying. www.cyberaware.gov.uk, www.getsafeonline.org, www.bullying.co.uk. Top tips for staying safe online. Discuss these with the vulnerable adult. 1. Don't post any personal information online, like your address, email address, or mobile number. 2. Think carefully before posting pictures or videos of yourself. Once you've put a picture of yourself online, most people can see it and may be able to download it. It's not just yours anymore. 3. Keep your privacy settings as high as possible. 4. Never give out your passwords. 5. Don't befriend people you don't know. 6. Don't meet up with people you've met online. Speak to your family and carers about people who may be suggesting you do. 7. Remember that not everyone online is who they say they are. 8. Think carefully about what you say before you post something online. 9. Respect other people's views. Even if you don't agree with someone else's views, doesn't mean you need to be rude. 10. If you see something online that makes you feel uncomfortable, unsafe, or worried, leave the website, turn off your computer if you want to, and tell a trusted person immediately. Top tips for mobile phone safety. Discuss these with the vulnerable adult. 1. Remember, if you are being bullied, it isn't your fault, and there is nothing so awful that you can't speak to someone about it. Talk to a trusted person, family member, or carer. 2. Don't reply to any nasty messages you receive. 3. Don't reply to a text from someone you don't know. 4. Keep the messages you have been sent so you can show them to a trusted person and make a note of the time and date of the messages or calls you receive. 5. Don't answer calls from withheld numbers or numbers you don't recognise. Let it go to voicemail. 6. Block numbers from people who are sending you nasty messages, phone calls. 7. If you are bullied repeatedly, you can change your number. 8. Don't give your mobile number to someone you don't know. 9. Don't send pictures to someone you don't know. 10. If the problem is serious, you can report it to the police, cyber mentors. Top tips if you are being bullied online. Discuss these with your vulnerable adult. 1. Tell someone you trust if you are being cyberbullied. 2. Don't respond or retaliate to bullying messages. It could make things worse. 3. Block users who send you nasty messages. 4. Save abusive emails or messages or texts you receive. 5. Make a note of dates and times you receive bullying messages, as well as details you have of the user's ID and the URL. 6. Don't pass on any cyberbullying videos or messages. This is cyberbullying. 7. If you are bullied repeatedly, change your user ID or profile and use a name that doesn't give any information away about you. Visit www.bullying.co.uk. This is a website where trained counsellors can support you if you are being bullied, either by chatting online or by calling their free helpline. You can also find some top tips on how to stay safe. Let us now look at financial abuse. The definition is where one person, usually a family member or close person, has formed control over the other person's access to financial resources, which reduces their capability to provide for themselves, forcing them to rely on the other person financially. Everyone has the right to their own money, property that is legally theirs, and personal possessions. This type of abuse relates to vulnerable adults and victims of domestic violence. Examples of this are personal money, possessions, entitlements, being borrowed, withdrawn without consent, withholding of funds, stopping the person from purchasing things they need or paying for activities, the misuse of money, possessions, property without their consent, for example, change of name of property, loans being taken out, items being purchased in the vulnerable adult's name, pressurized into signing financial documents, allowing another person to act on your behalf, for example, the formation of a will, property purchase, and/or beneficiary of financial assets. Behavioural indicators can be confusion, unable to recall purchases when questioned by family, carer, or believe they may have mislaid money but can't be sure where, etc. Constantly looking for things, going through receipts in their purse, belongings. Scared, anxious when certain people are around. Unable to pay bills, whereas previously bills were always paid on time. Unable to explain where their money, benefits have gone, particularly after payment date. Concealment of bank statements, receipts, jewellery and other personal valuables. Reluctance of those in control of finances to replace much-needed comforts, clothing, equipment. Pressured into answering questions relating to finances and lack of interest in their care and well-being. Physical indicators can be disarray in a person's home, room, suggestion of someone going through belongings, unexplained bruises to the wrists, face, other places of the body, shaken, scared, anxious in contrast to their previous happy, calm nature. Factors that increase the risks of financial abuse to a vulnerable adult. Due to lack of mental capacity, the vulnerable adult is unable to control own finances. They live on their own and are at risk of bogus callers to the home, salespersons, loan companies. The person is already financially dependent on other people to control their money. We will now look at organisational abuse. The definition of this form of abuse is where poor care and neglect occurs within an establishment of care, for example a care home, hospital, or the vulnerable adult's own home. Everyone has the right to an acceptable standard of care as set out by the government laws and legislation. The maltreatment of vulnerable adults can occur where their needs and requirements are not prioritised to ensure the smooth running to the setting and/or services for their own financial gains. Organisational abuse, often referred to as institutional abuse, is more likely to take place where the staff team are lacking in adequate communication skills, speak another language. We will now look at discriminatory abuse. The definition is, this form of abuse can be incorporated in all other forms of abuse, including all forms of mistreatment due to a person's race, gender, disability, faith, culture, human traits or sexual orientation. Discriminatory abuse is the misuse of authority to deny the vulnerable adult of their basic human rights. The vulnerable adult can be left feeling frightened and that they are at risk of being harmed. Discriminatory abuse can be where a person's cultural or religious needs are not considered and the provision of care is not equally provided for the individual person. Examples of discriminatory abuse are experiences discriminatory jokes and slurs, sizist, ageist, sexist, racist insults, insults relating to a variety of disabilities, for example, learning, mentally, physically, sensory, appearance, person treated differently from others in the setting, for example, care home staff regularly giving more food to one person than another, a vulnerable person experiencing blame for something that they didn't do, excluded, denied access to a variety of services. Physical indicators can be anxious, depressed, lonely, reserved, experiencing change in weight, i.e. loss, displaying changes in character, examples being irritation, loss of confidence, annoyance. Further information can be found in the following documents: Equality Act 2010, Care Act 2014, on www.legislation.gov.uk website. We will now look at domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is often not viewed as a form of abuse, but as an entitlement or justified violence within a marriage or in cohabitation relationship. Domestic abuse can include violence against children, family members, and the elder generation. The government defines domestic abuse as any incident of threatening behaviour, violence or abuse, psychological, physical, sexual, financial or emotional, between adults who have been intimate partners or family members regardless of gender or sexuality. The outcomes of domestic abuse are devastating and can have long-term effects. We have all seen reports in the newspaper and on television where vulnerable adults of various ages have taken their own lives because they could not cope with being abused. Domestic abuse can also lead into other forms of abuse, such as physical, sexual, emotional, financial abuse. This form of violence is not restricted to class. It can occur in vulnerable adults regardless of wealth, gender, age, race, sexuality, and disability. We know from statistics that the figure is higher of domestic violence of men towards women than the other way around. The statistics also inform us that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. However, we must be mindful that there is also a connection between domestic violence and child abuse. Children are affected in various ways and can require as much support as the vulnerable adult. Some examples of domestic abuse are: the offender displays violence towards the vulnerable adult. However, they can control their temper in front of others, for example, whilst caring one-to-one in a private home compared to a work environment in a care home. The offender can compose themselves quickly if someone comes to the door, for example, a neighbour or services. The offender can choose to inflict injuries on the vulnerable adult's body in places that tend to be hidden from others. The offender can damage vulnerable adults' personal belongings in anger, but not their own belongings. The offender makes all the decisions within the home and their lives, ignoring the vulnerable adult's needs. The offender will often use derogatory language, insults, shouts, lose their temper at the slightest thing. The offender has previously experienced a violent relationship and carries the behaviour into subsequent relationships. The offender will question the vulnerable adult repeatedly over their whereabouts and company they have been with, often confusing them in the process. It is to be highlighted that there are concerns within the Black and minority ethnic (BME) communities where honour-based violence, female genital mutilation (FGM), and forced marriage take place and require support. Let us now look at modern slavery. The definition of this tells us, slavery is not a form of abuse that resides in history. Modern slavery exists in the present day in one way or another in every country around the world and can affect people of all ages, gender and races. This form of abuse includes prostitution, both men and women, forced labour, human trafficking, generational debt, the marrying of young girls to older gentlemen. The Home Office estimates that there are 13,000 victims and survivors of modern slavery and survivors. Shockingly, 55% of these are female, and 35% of all victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation. Human trafficking is often associated to modern slavery. It is the trade of humans, men, women and children, through transporting and concealing, for the purpose of forced labour, sexual exploitation and commercial exploitation. It can also be for forced marriage and forced organ removal for the extraction of organs or tissues. 42% of all trafficking, prostitution and child abuse is for sexual exploitation, 20% of which are children. Trafficking will be carried out by individual adults for their personal financial gain or by organised gangs on a large scale. This is often achieved in the sexual exploitation of vulnerable adults and then sold on for further financial gain. The indicators are closely associated with those of modern slavery. Physical indicators can be malnourished, dishevelled appearance, reserved, old, neglected wounds and injuries, with vulnerable adult being vague, having no recollection of how they happened, inappropriate clothing for work being undertaken, unable to respond to direct questions, often looking for someone else to speak on their behalf. For those able to communicate, they appear to be controlled, nervous, quiet. Communication in English is limited, if at all. Fearful of speaking with authorities. Owns very few personal possessions. Seldom interacts with others in the community they are living and working within. Unable to show or account for their legal documents, passport, driving licence, national insurance identification, etc., or documents that are provided are fake. Environmental indicators of living conditions of vulnerable adults can be security cameras installed around the property. Entrance and other door openings are restricted or sealed. Windows are covered, obscured by curtains continuously drawn. Railings, bars are placed over the windows. Numerous people all sharing the same property. Dirty, confined dwelling. Property in need of urgent repair. We will now look at self-neglect. The definition is that this is a difficult form of abuse to describe due to the broadness of its nature. It is a behavioural condition, both intentional and unintentional, in which a person will primarily neglect their basic care and needs. This includes their health, personal hygiene, their clothing, diet, attention to medical needs. A vulnerable adult displaying signs of self-neglect may also be suffering with several forms of abuse at the same time. Self-neglect can also come into a person's living conditions, particularly if they are a hoarder. It is difficult for those who care for vulnerable adults to decide if the conditions they live in are acceptable or they are at risk in living in this way and may require further support. Although help and support may be offered, care staff must acknowledge and accept a person's independence, how they choose to live, and ultimately, they may refuse any help from outside services. This can be extremely difficult for those working with the vulnerable adult, especially if they observe it is damaging the person's overall health. When concerns are raised, there are clinical, social, and/or ethical decisions to be made about how the issues are managed. Often self-neglect is categorized by an endangerment to their self through hazardous behaviors, consistent lack of personal hygiene, clothing, and/or living environment, in addition to a frequent rejection of all services offered to them, which would improve the quality of their life. It is vital that all carers of vulnerable adults are capable and aware of the factors which places the adult at risk. These can often be down to a mental illness, which increases their vulnerability to abuse and self-neglect, in turn increasing the risk of developing health-related conditions. It can also be due to age-related illnesses, which can result in decline of motor skills, mental capacity, and overall body strength. Statutory interventions will often take place when a vulnerable adult who is mentally capable consistently refuses to accept and acknowledge they require assistance and places them at risk of significant harm. Behavioural indicators can be neglect of home maintenance, which creates dangerous living conditions, meagre diet, nutrition, lack of fresh fruit, vegetables, and/or food that is unfit for consumption, refusal to cooperate with those services that assist with personal hygiene and care, refusal to medical attention as required, treatments and medicines which could impact their general health, refusal to attend meetings held by professionals, for example healthcare, social care, housing, etc., refusal to cooperate with utility companies, gas, electricity, water. Where no change in circumstances has occurred, despite self-neglect being reported by well-intentioned members of the community and other agencies. Dwelling develops vermin due to the filthy conditions, causing a health risk to self and others nearby. Support services place complaints and/or refuse to attend properties of those vulnerable adults with self-neglect for fear of potential risk to themselves. It can be problematic for those vulnerable adults whose behaviours are closely linked to mental health problems, both diagnosed or undiagnosed, mental reasoning, and/or additional antisocial behaviours. These vulnerable adults will require support, however, will often not be eligible for specific services.